The look on Mark's face when the FCC field agent held up his badge and asked to see his broadcasting credentials was worth more than every piece of vintage copper, vacuum tube, and hand-soldered wire he'd stolen from me. I sat on my porch barely 10 feet away, sipping a lukewarm cup of Earl Grey and watching the color drain from my son-in-law's face until he was the exact shade of a fresh coat of primer. 20 years of building a legacy, 40 years of collecting, and 6 months of being treated like a senile, atmospheric nuisance had all led to this moment. Mark thought he was a visionary, a content creator destined for the big leagues, and he decided my life's work was the seed money for his dream. But as the agent pulled out a clipboard and started citing federal statutes, Mark finally realized that I wasn't just a retired old man with a hobby. I was the man who knew exactly which lever to pull to bring his entire world crashing down. To understand why I didn't just yell at him, you have to understand what I built. I spent 35 years as a senior systems engineer for the regional power grid. I'm a man of schematics, tolerances, and long-term stability. When I wasn't keeping the lights on for 3 counties, I was in my workshop. My ham radio collection wasn't just old junk, as Mark liked to call it. It was a museum of 20th century communication. I had a pristine Collins KWM2, a rare Holocrafters HT32, and a series of custom-built linear amplifiers that could bounce a signal off the moon if the atmospheric conditions were right. I'd spent 40 years sourcing original parts, some from estate sales in Ohio, others from retired sailors in Germany. The total valuation of the room was upwards of $120,000, but to me, it was my connection to the world. It was how I'd talk to researchers in Antarctica and hobbyists in Tokyo. It was my sanctuary. The first crock in the foundation appeared about 3 years ago, when my daughter, Sarah, married Mark. Now, I love my daughter, but Sarah has always been prone to falling for big thinkers. Mark was a 34-year-old man who called himself a digital strategist but hadn't held a steady job in 18 months. When they hit a rough patch and couldn't make rent on their trendy downtown apartment, I did what any father would do. I invited them to move into the guest wing of my house. I'd spent 40 years providing for my family, and I wasn't about to stop then. I even renovated the space over the garage for them, giving them their own entrance and a sense of independence. I thought I was being a good father. That should have been my wake-up call, but I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that Mark just needed a win to get his feet under him. If that had been the end of it, I probably would have just let his snide comments go. But then came the branding phase. Mark decided that the reason his previous business ventures failed wasn't a lack of work ethic, but a lack of presence. He decided he was going to launch a high-end podcast focusing on the architecture of success. He needed a professional studio, not just a desk and a microphone, but a soundproofed, state-of-the-art environment. The problem was the only space in the house that was isolated enough for his needs was my radio room. "Think about the ROI, Arthur," he told me over dinner one night, swirling a glass of my 18-year-old scotch like he'd actually paid for it. "You've got all that dusty equipment sitting there, taking up prime real estate. Nobody uses shortwave anymore. It's a dead medium. I'm talking about the future. I'm talking about building a brand that could support this whole family." I told him, as calmly as I could, that the room wasn't for sale and the equipment stayed. Sarah looked down at her plate, and Mark just gave me this pitying smile, the kind you give a toddler who thinks he's an astronaut. "Sure, Arthur, whatever you say. Just seems a shame to let all that value just rot." And that's when I realized he didn't see me as a father or even a provider. He saw me as a bank account with a pulse, an obstacle standing between him and the money he felt he deserved. Something in me shifted that day. I didn't say a word. I didn't argue, but I started making calls, and I quietly moved my most precious logs and rare manuals to a safety deposit box. The escalation happened fast. Mark started borrowing money for equipment upgrades that never seemed to arrive. Then he started complaining that my radio transmissions, when I'd spend an hour on the air in the evenings, were interfering with his headspace and creating electronic noise in his demo recordings. I ignored him. He was a guest in my home, and I was the one paying the property taxes. But then I had to head out of town for 4 days to attend the funeral of my oldest friend, a man I'd served with in the Navy. When I pulled back into my driveway on that Tuesday evening, the house felt different. It was too quiet. I walked up to the guest wing, intending to drop off a souvenir for Sarah, when I smelled it, the sharp chemical scent of fresh acoustic foam and industrial adhesive. I pushed open the door to my radio room. It was gone. The Collins, the Holocrafters, the custom amplifiers, the racks of spare vacuum tubes, everything. In their place were gray foam panels glued directly over my vintage wallpaper. A sleek white laminate desk stood where my workbench used to be, topped with a cheap plastic arm and a professional microphone that looked like it cost $50. My heart didn't race, it went cold. It was a very specific kind of cold, the kind that comes when you've spent a lifetime calculating tolerances and you realize a bridge has just collapsed. I found them in the kitchen. Mark was beaming, holding a glass of sparkling cider. Surprise! I didn't want you to have to deal with the stress of the transition, Arthur, so while you were away, I took care of it. I had a guy come in, a specialist. He took all that old gear off our hands. Got a fair price for it, too. It covered the entire studio build-out, plus I've got a little left over for the first month's marketing budget. I looked at Sarah. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "It's better this way, Dad," she whispered. "Mark is finally excited about something, and that room was so cluttered. You were always in there alone anyway." "How much?" I asked. My voice was level, flat. $14,000, Mark said proudly. Cash. The guy even hauled it away for free. $14,000. He'd sold $120,000 worth of rare, meticulously maintained history for pennies on the dollar to buy some foam and a desk. He'd stolen my life's work to fund a hobby he'd likely quit in 3 months. I didn't scream. I didn't throw him out that night. I knew that if I acted in anger, they'd play the victim. Sarah would call me difficult and Mark would spin a story about my declining mental state. No, I needed to be methodical. I needed to be an engineer. "I see," I said. "Well, you've certainly been busy." I spent the next 2 months getting everything in order. They had no idea what was coming. None of them did. Mark spent his days in his studio, shouting into his microphone about hustle culture and disrupting the status quo. I, meanwhile, was doing some disrupting of my own.
First, I tracked down where the equipment went. Mark wasn't a genius. He'd sold it to a local estate liquidator who was essentially a glorified fence. I didn't try to buy it back. Not yet. Instead, I called a few old friends in the FCC's Enforcement Bureau. You see, when you operate high-powered amateur radio equipment, you have a license. But when you sell certain types of restricted, high-output broadcasting equipment, especially the kind of custom-modified linear amplifiers I owned, to unlicensed individuals, or if those individuals attempt to operate without a license, the federal government gets very, very interested. And then there was the matter of Mark's studio. Mark had upgraded the wiring in the guest wing to handle his new equipment, and the high-powered LED lighting he'd installed for his video versions. He hadn't pulled a single permit. He'd bypassed the breakers I'd installed for the radio room because they kept tripping when he turned on his studio lights. But the real kicker was the bonus I'd left for him. One of my old amplifiers, a unit I'd been repairing, was actually a high-gain repeater I'd been tinkering with. It was still in the closet, hidden behind some boxes Mark hadn't bothered to move. It was hooked up to an old antenna lead that ran through the walls. With a few simple remote modifications, all legal for a licensed operator like myself, I could ensure that every time Mark turned on his professional microphone, he wasn't just recording a podcast, he was inadvertently broadcasting a high-gain, unmodulated signal that would bleed into every emergency frequency, aircraft band, and local television signal within a 5-mile radius. I waited for the day Mark announced his grand launch, a live-streamed 4-hour marathon event to debut his brand. The morning of the launch, I sat on my porch. I'd already filed the formal complaint with the FCC regarding unidentified high-gain interference originating from my own address, specifically citing the unauthorized sale and potential misuse of restricted radio components. I'd also called the county building inspector about smelling smoke coming from the guest wing's new wiring. The reckoning began at 10:15 a.m. Mark was mid-sentence, probably explaining how to monetize your mindset, when a black SUV and a county Jan pulled into the driveway. I didn't get up. I just watched. Agent Miller from the FCC stepped out, followed by 2 other men carrying signal triangulation equipment. They didn't even knock on the front door. They followed the signal straight to the guest wing. I saw Mark's face through the window as they walked in. The smirk didn't just fade, it evaporated. I stood up and walked over as the building inspector was finishing his initial look at the fuse box. "Is there a problem, officer?" I asked, my voice dripping with concerned innocence. Agent Miller looked at me, then at Mark, who was standing in the middle of his studio, surrounded by foam and expensive lights. "Mr. Henderson, we've traced a massive amount of illegal interference to this specific room. We're also here regarding a report of the sale of restricted, high-output transmission equipment without the proper federal documentation." "Illegal?" Mark stammered, his voice 3 octaves higher than it was on his podcast. I'm just recording a show. It's digital. It's the internet." "The internet doesn't broadcast on 144 megahertz and bleed into the local airport's approach path, son,"
Miller said, his voice cold. "And this wiring. Who did this?" The building inspector stepped forward, shaking his head. "This is a fire trap. No permits, no inspections, and you've bypassed the load-bearing breakers. I'm tagging this entire wing as uninhabitable effective immediately. You've got 2 hours to vacate before I cut the main power to this section of the house." Sarah came running out then, her face red. "Dad, what is happening? Tell them they can't do this."
I looked at her, then at Mark, who was looking at a federal fine that I knew, from my research, started at $15,000 per violation. With the number of frequencies he'd been hitting, he was looking at close to $100,000 in penalties, not to mention the potential for criminal charges for the theft and unauthorized sale of the equipment, which I'd already reported to the local police as a separate matter. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I said calmly. "I told Mark the equipment was important. I told him it stayed. He decided he knew better. He decided to sell property that wasn't his, to fund a business that's currently violating several federal laws and local building codes. I'm just a retired old man, remember? I don't understand the ROI of these things." "Arthur, please," Mark pleaded, "the architecture of success crumbling in real time. We can fix this. I'll get the gear back. I'll pay you back." "With what, Mark?" I asked. "The equipment is already gone. The estate liquidators sold it to a collector in Chicago. A friend of mine, actually, who called me the second he saw it on the manifest. He's holding it for me. But as for the $14,000 you spent, that's gone. And as for this studio, well, the inspector says it has to go." The silence that followed was heavy. Mark looked at the FCC agents, then at the uninhabitable sticker being slapped onto his door. He realized there was no pivot here. No hustle could get him out of a federal investigation and a total loss of his investment. I handed Agent Miller a folder. "This is the itemized list of the equipment that was removed without my consent, including the serial numbers and the power specifications. You'll find that the interference started exactly when the studio was powered up." Mark spent the next 6 hours being questioned. By the time they left, he was a broken man. Sarah was crying, packing their bags into their car. They couldn't stay in the guest wing. It was legally condemned until the wiring was ripped out and replaced. And since I was the owner of the house, I made it very clear that I wouldn't be paying for the repairs while they were living there. The aftermath was quiet, just the way I like it. Sarah and Mark moved into a cramped studio apartment on the far side of town. Mark is currently working at a call center to pay off his legal fees and the massive fines the FCC levied against him. Sarah calls me every Sunday now. She's much more polite these days. She even asks about my hobbies. I've since had the guest wing rewired, properly this time. My equipment is back where it belongs. My friend in Chicago shipped it back the week after the incident. The foam panels are gone, the vintage wallpaper is restored, and the air is once again filled with the warm, comforting hum of vacuum tubes. Sometimes I'll sit in my chair, adjust the dial on the Collins KWM2, and listen to the static of the universe. It's a clean signal now, no interference, just the way I planned it. It's funny how people think that because you're patient, you're weak. They forget that the most dangerous man in the room is the one who knows exactly how the system works and exactly how to make it stop.